You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. Roland Kays is a zoologist with a broad interest in ecology and conservation, especially of mammals. He studies research questions that are scientifically interesting but also have real-world relevance through educational or conservation value. An expert in using new technologies to study free-ranging animals, especially to track their movement with GPS tags and camera traps, Kays is a prolific producer of wildlife education and tracking content on his site, rolandkays.com. He was featured on National Geographic's World's Weirdest and has been a regular expert on shows on the Science Channel. Roland, thank you so much for being on Rewilding Earth.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
I am fascinated by your work. You mentioned in one of your videos, one of your very, very many videos, that you are aware that you have the coolest job in the world. And I just want to reiterate that fact. You have my job. Somehow you got my job.
Well, thanks. I feel lucky to be able to get out in the woods and chase animals and do science and then try to connect with people about that as well.
What makes you who you are? I mean, were you doing this when you were a kid? Were you outside all the time? What's your creation story?
Well, yeah. So when I was a kid, I was definitely running around the woods a lot. I grew up in Michigan and kind of in the suburbs, I guess, medium-sized town. And used to go fishing and catching frogs and building forts, and it was in the Boy Scouts and all that kind of stuff. But then I also really liked science in school. That was my favorite subject. And then when I went to college, I was into biology, but it was always sort of molecular and genetic and those kinds of things. And then after my freshman year, I had a job working in a lab at a medical school, which I should have loved, but I hated it. It was just exhausting to me to be in a lab all day long. And I just didn't find the work very interesting. So when I went back my sophomore year, I was kind of like, well, I still want to do science, but can I do it where I don't have to work in a lab all day long, doing microscope stuff? And so that's where I started to realize, oh, I could actually do ecology. I could do stuff with animals and stuff with outdoors and actually try to make a difference. And so that's kind of where my career shifted.
And you've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, trying to.
Everybody can find you on rolandkays.com and quickly get the idea that you're a prolific producer of content. You have a lot of animals that you've done studies with and a lot of television programs you've been involved with. But what I really wanted to talk about today was coyotes and the things that you're actually finding on the ground. I really love talking to people on the ground because it kind of ties together what you see in headlines and articles, which feel all very anecdotal compared to talking to somebody like you who really has a lay of the land. And yeah, I would love to know why there are coyotes in the East in the first place.
Right. Well, that's kind of a good question to start with because they didn't used to be here and they sort of moved in starting kind of in the 40s or 50s, till around probably by 2000, they'd covered basically the entire East Coast. And we recently went back and looked at these records and did a big map that shows where the coyotes used to be and where they are today. And what we found was that from 1900 back, so going back to, old museum specimens from the 1800s or going back to the fossil record, you find that coyotes were always only in the West. There were no records really from the East, and they were, basically in non-forested areas. So they weren't in the Pacific Northwest rainforest. They weren't in the Great Northern Forest or the rainforests of the South or the Eastern deciduous forest. And then starting right around 1900, they started expanding, not only east, but also south. They've gone all the way to Panama now, north. They're in Alaska. They never used to be in Alaska. Now they're up in Alaska. And then east and covered, sort of the whole East Coast. They moved in two main fronts, one along the south and one kind of up through the north, through Ontario and into upstate New York and New England. And that northern front actually moved a lot faster than the other fronts, than the southern front. And also those animals had some wolf genes. So we know that the coyotes from the Great Lakes area, they hybridized with some wolves. And some of those coyotes had a little bit of wolf genes, and that kind of has mixed in, especially in the Northeast. And so those animals moved a little bit faster. And what's interesting is across the entire East Coast, there were also animals being brought in. And so trappers would bring them in. Sometimes they thought they were fox puppies and they turned out to be coyotes, or there were different groups that were bringing coyotes in that were releasing them intentionally or accidentally. But they were always very scattered. And as far as we can tell, none of them really contributed much to the gene pool. It was really this sort of advancing front of coyotes that was this sort of natural colonization of the area.
One of the kind of layperson questions I have anyway is I've always heard that wolves and coyotes don't mix. And the only interaction I ever really hear about is how wolves manage, meaning they kill I've heard every coyote they see. How does hybridization even work in that situation? I think people would be surprised to hear that.
Right, that's a really good question, because definitely, wolves and coyotes are enemies for the most part, and they do kill each other. But what and so on an average day, they don't kill each other. The wolves kill the coyotes, and on the average day, that's going to happen. But what we think happened in some cases was when the wolves were really hurting population-wise. They were very low numbers. So if you look sort of late 1800s, early 1900s. There were only a few wolves left in the lower 48 states, in the Great Lakes area, Wisconsin, Minnesota area. And basically, there would have been some situations where we think it was always a female wolf was coming into heat, and there were no male wolves around. And so she kind of had to take the best thing that you could get, which would be, in that case, a coyote. So we know that they're different species. They still can hybridize, and they can have fertile offspring. But normally they don't do it unless one animal is really rare and the other animal is more common. And so we don't see it happening anymore today. The wolf population in the Great Lakes area has recovered, and we don't see any evidence of what we call a F1, a first generation hybrids occurring anymore. So that's how we think it happened. We think it happened with the red wolf in the Southeast as well, when the red wolf was driven down to the last few animals in Louisiana and Texas. We think that's when they started hybridizing with coyotes. We think it happened in the Great Lakes with wolves. And then the other thing that we found evidence for is that as these coyotes advance, and let's say the first coyote to cross the St. Lawrence Seaway into northern New York, if that was a female, or whenever the first female got there, she would have had no other coyotes to breed with. And so there was some hybridization with dogs at that point in time. And again, it was probably it was definitely a female coyote, because we can see it in the genetic patterns with a dog. And what happened in both these cases is that these genes get mixed up, but then more coyotes show up, and more coyotes show up, and more coyotes show up, and they cross back into the coyote populations, and all these genes are mixed up into something we call a hybrid swarm. What that means is that the genes end up getting diluted. So the first animal is half wolf and half coyote, but then they breed back with other coyotes. So then it's 75% coyote, 25% wolf. And then they breed back in with some other coyotes. So what we see in the Northeast today is sort of roughly 85% coyote and sort of 7 or 8% dog, and 7 or 8% wolf. And as you go southeast, you end up with less wolf, but still some dog. So they're mostly coyote. They're still coyotes, right? They're still 80, 90 some percent coyote, but with a little bit of these other genes mixed in.
Do they have any wolfy attitude? Less skittish? Did anything change in their behavior between them and Western coyotes?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So we know they're bigger, right? They're larger animals. Mm-hmm. They're sort of, Western coyotes sort of tend to range in the about 25 pounds, and Eastern coyotes tend to be sort of 35 pounds. They max out around 50 pounds. A 40-some pound coyote, 45-pound coyote is really big.
Yeah.
There are these tournaments, people have these hunting tournaments where they try to kill as many coyotes, and the heaviest coyote wins, and usually a 49 or 51 pounder will win that. So that's kind of where they max out in the East. And we've actually shown that some of that is due to wolf genes. So some of the wolf genes that are still in the coyote population that seem to be helping them survive are associated with body size, with bone growth, with just sort of different things that we know what these genes do from looking at them in dogs or in mouses or mice or in labs or something. We have some idea of the function of those genes, and we can see these eastern coyotes have the wolf version of that gene, and so we think it's helping them be larger. Behavior, we don't know. Um, what we do find is, generally, if you look at conflict between coyotes and people where they're killing pets, there's very few attacks on people, but they do happen sometimes. Generally, it's more dogs and cats. That's happening a lot more out west than in the east. So it doesn't seem like it's made them any more dangerous. It's probably had no effect. It's just kind of a lack of evidence more than any actual evidence.
Yeah, well, lack of evidence. I mean, it's not for lack of trying. People like you are out there all the time collecting data on this stuff. So if there was a problem that I think is some people believe that there would be a lot more evidence, I would imagine, because it's not like we're not looking.
Yeah, but right. So it's not like coyotes never cause problems. Some people like to paint coyotes like this harmless creature, and why would you ever kill a coyote? And I think they do. They in the California, they're jumping 9-foot high fences and getting to people's backyards and killing their dogs. I mean, that's a real serious thing that happens every month or every week. I see it in the news. I get a little coyote news sticker. And so those animals are getting bold, and it's interesting to think about, how that could happen or how we could manage it. And if you think about a rural coyote, if a rural coyote gets bold, it's going to get shot. And if a coyote living in, Santa Monica gets bold, you can't hunt coyotes in Santa Monica. And so there's not much you can do about it. So I think it might be less of a hybridization thing and more of just kind of how these populations are evolving to specialize on urban habitats.
What other animal in your experience is as prolific and as able to adjust and adapt to so many different environments and just be so darn successful as a coyote?
Humans.
Well,
that's it.
Darn it. That was a layup. Darn it. It's something for humans.
And I mean, the other interesting parallel with humans is we found now that humans are actually 2 or 3 species hybrids ourselves, right? There's evidence that we have a little bit of Neanderthal genes in our genome in some populations. There's also a second species that was one of our relatives, a long time ago, called the Denisovians. That there's some DNA in some human populations today left over from that. So it's probably the same thing where, as one population was getting really, really rare, there was some hybridization. Those genes crossed back into the population, and they're still there, and they're still doing, they're still acting. And whether they're beneficial or problematic, I'm not sure. But it's interesting that humans and coyotes are both sort of spreading around the world and very adaptable, and also it just shows us this hybridization isn't as uncommon as we used to think it is. So, I don't know. Otherwise, raccoons, rats, those are 2 other species that seem to do very well.
Mosquitoes are my nemesis.
Mosquitoes, yeah. It's hard to top that.
Do you think that this hybridization has anything to do with the idea that you see around the internet an awful lot, that the more pressure you put on coyote populations, that changes their breeding cycles, that actually can help their populations grow? Maybe these coyote killing contests or anything like that. Is there really anything to that? Because if you look at the internet for just an hour, you can see that the jury is still out among the lay people. So here's your chance to put that to bed.
Yeah, sure. Well, so this isn't work that I've done myself, but I've read a bunch of the papers that I don't think hybridization plays a role necessarily, because this happens in the Western United States as well as in the Eastern United States. And the point is, it's just kind of impossible to get rid of coyotes, or even to reduce their numbers in any meaningful way for very long. And so there's been a bunch of different projects where they've tried an experiment. They said, all right, let's get rid of as many coyotes as we can. So they hire a bunch of trappers. Sometimes they're even shooting the coyotes out of helicopters to really, really put a lot of pressure on them and really, really try to reduce the population. And what they find is sometimes if you try hard enough, you can dampen their population, but just for a little bit, and they bounce right back. And part of it is what you mentioned, that they kind of change their breeding, and that the young will breed at a younger age, basically. And so that ramps up their pup production a little bit. But what I think is even more important is just their dispersal ability. One recent study found that 40% of the coyotes at any one time running around the landscape are looking for a territory. They're non-territorial animals that are trying to find a home, and they can go, hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so basically, as soon as you remove, if you have a coyote there, a young coyote can't go in because it's going to get beat up. There's a territory there. As soon as you remove that coyote, there's probably, 3 or 4 or 5 animals that go in and try to take over that territory. And eventually it'll level off and one will take that over. But so I think that is actually probably a bigger factor in this sort of impossibility of controlling coyote population by hunting or trapping. But I think there's an important caveat that I'm not against coyote hunting and trapping as management, because I think it has the potential to have important impacts on their behavior, right? Sort of this boldness thing we were talking about earlier. If coyotes don't fear humans as predators, then I think they're more likely to come into conflict with us. Whereas if they see us as a risk, they're going to be a lot more shy. They're not going to be sneaking into our backyards. They're going to stay away from us. And I think that has a better sort of long-term coexistence potential between humans and coyotes.
And talking about balance, you were part of a coyote and deer population study, I believe, and have weighed in on that topic quite a bit. What do we need to know about? I mean, there are some people who have argued that coyotes coming into an area will affect the deer population negatively. Usually hunters are very upset about that. I live in Indiana, and I've never lived in this state when deer weren't considered a nuisance, a problem, like way, way overpopulated all the time. I've had friends in accidents, hitting them with cars, and it's just a thing around here is that we have deer falling out of the trees. And my thing has always been, well, if we had wolves here, I wonder what it would be like. And
Right.
And if you have wolves, this whole thing, so it's kind of a triangular thing. It's not just the coyote and the deer population study, which you should talk about and set that straight about deer populations, but also talk about what if wolves were here, just as an exercise.
We basically, I mean, you kind of just gave away our punchline with your story about Indiana. We just, we asked this question of if coyotes are having a big impact on the deer population, then we had this great experiment that we set up earlier when we talked about, well, the East Coast used to not have any coyotes, and now they have coyotes. So if coyotes were having a big impact on deer, you would expect to see some big crash in the deer population after coyotes show up. And, maybe it doesn't happen right away because maybe the first coyotes that show up, there's just not enough coyotes. But then, after 10 or 20 years, do you see a crash? And so what we did was we worked with data from 6 different states on over 300 different counties, where at each county they'd monitored just how many deer were hunted, were killed by hunters. And that there's ways you can adjust that to get that as a measure of deer abundance. And it's not a perfect measure, but it's a pretty good proxy for deer abundance. As the harvest, as the population goes up, there's more deer hunted per year. And like I said, there's some ways you can adjust that for effort. So anyway, the great thing is we had over 300 time series where we know for this county how many deer were harvested every single year. And then we plotted, well, when did coyotes arrive? And then we looked to see, was there a consistent crash, right when coyotes arrived, or after 10 years or 20 years, or after some lag. We didn't find any consistent effect. So sort of our conclusion was at large scales, sort of looking at the whole East Coast, we had data from New York State and Florida, so kind of across a pretty big swath of area. Do we see a consistent crash in the deer population after coyotes arrived? And the answer was no. So it doesn't mean that coyotes never have an impact at a smaller level. In some years, on really hard years, they might have more of a hard time. But I think, like you said, there's just so many deer out there that coyotes are just living off the excess. They're just eating they're certainly eating some fawns, they're eating the roadkills, they're eating the injured animals, but they're also eating, rabbits and mice and fruit, insects, or they're opportunistic. They eat whatever's the most available. And the other caveat is it looks like coyote populations in the East Coast are still growing. So maybe at some point they'll hit carrying capacity and they'll have more of an effect on the deer population. But I wouldn't bet on that because I think they're just too small of a predator. Their body size is just too small. They don't seem to be consistently hunting deer in groups. I know there's definitely some records. I've seen some videos of pairs of coyotes taking down a deer, but they're not pack hunters the way wolves are, and so they're just not very effective deer hunters.
There's the Yellowstone wolf video and all of the articles and anecdotal evidence that has been produced since wolves were reintroduced there, and how things had gotten really out of control in the absence of wolves. And we didn't really know that until the wolves were put back, how out of
Right.
control things were, out of balance. And mountain lands moved back up a little bit in altitude, and certainly coyotes were dispersed. Can you talk about what would the effect be, say, if we had a viable population of the wolves that we barely have hanging on in the east? Not that it might happen; it's very unlikely that it does. But what if wolves were back in the picture? What would happen in the east?
Well, yeah. I mean, I, I don't. I do not think that we will never have wolves in the east. I think when you look at wolf recovery in Germany and Denmark, and
True.
if
Yep.
they can have breeding wolves in Denmark, for God's sake, we can have them in the eastern United States. But
I agree.
beyond that, is let's say we had a proper full size wolf. They would definitely reduce the coyote population. They can do what human hunters can't do, for two reasons. One is they're very effective at killing the coyotes. They have this, what we call this direct effect at removing animals from the population. But then more importantly, they have this second indirect effect, which is the fear. And so coyotes fear wolves, and they totally change the way they use the landscape because they're always worried about getting killed by a wolf. And they don't really have that fear as much with humans, and that's kind of why we run into this problem with some of the bold coyotes. But so, I think they would dramatically reduce the coyote population in the areas where the wolves lived. Now what would be interesting is what would happen in the more developed areas where you have coyotes living in suburbia, where you would never have wolves, and so that probably wouldn't make much of a change there. But in the areas where you do have wolves, I think it would have a significant impact on the coyote population.
It's ironic that humans think they can manage the deer population, and we can't. Obviously, there's a lot of empirical evidence on that as well, and by hunting and the wolf populations. And you were pretty adamant earlier, saying that there's just no way we can really truly knock those populations down on a big scale, maybe on a local scale, somewhat. But there's always something there to fill back in. But as soon as I'm just always been fascinated by when you just add wolves, that one ingredient affects so many different things. And then you were pretty adamant about wolves will control the population. And I always like to rib the hunters, the really hardcore ones, as much as I can. If you guys are so worried about the coyotes, why don't you just let us reintroduce wolves? And they just go crazy when you say that. I mean, they just lose their minds because there's no real, they are true believers when it comes to their ability to knock the populations down and keep them in check.
I'm a deer hunter, and I think deer hunters in general have gotten used to there being a lot of deer, but they're not generally controlling the numbers to the extent, and we're having we run camera traps all over the place here in North Carolina, and we get, I think, 3/4 of our pictures are deer. They're just everywhere. There's so many of them. Yeah, humans are doing some, but there's not enough hunting. Even here in North Carolina, we have really lax regulations about how many deer you can hunt because they want people to hunt more deer, and it's just doesn't seem to be making the difference.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, some of it could just be what's happening to hunting. I mean, we would have to somehow mirror the best we could what wolves were doing, and if we're not able to do that, and the regulations are lax, there's just not enough people out there hunting. It's not a common thing for conservationists to hear, because we always assume that everybody's out there with AKs and everything else and doing crazy stuff. And you're saying that's not true.
Well, I mean, the hunter population, the sort of number of people that hunting is slowly going down in the U.S. So there does seem to be less hunting. There's still a lot, right? There's more people, there's more hunters in the United States than sort of the 19 largest combined armies in the world. So, hunting has a big impact overall. We have a relatively small hunting season. I think we should have an open season, a longer season. Not an open season, but I think season should be longer. Because the other thing is, I think you don't have the same fear effects with humans as hunters, right? Like I mentioned, predators like wolves, they have this direct impact of removing the animals from the population. But then they also have what we call an indirect effect, which is this fear effect, where the animals, the prey, avoid and are afraid of predators. And I don't think that's happening with humans. They see so many humans that aren't killing them that most of these animals are completely unafraid, and they'll feed in your backyard. You see them in the park. They don't run away. They totally don't see humans as threats, which I think is partly because we had this limited hunting season that's only for a few months. You look at, I've done some work over in Europe where they hunt more year round, and the animals are much more shy about humans because of I think because of that more year round effect. The other thing that I think would be great is if we allow people to sell wild game meat and make some money off of it. That's another thing you can do in most of the rest of the world that has good management plans. You can sell game meat to restaurants in Europe. You can sell kangaroos when you hunt them in Australia, and in the U.S. you're not allowed to do that. And I think the whole eat local movement could really benefit from hunting this native local meat that's overabundant. I feel like that's kind of an obvious solution, and there's just some strange barriers that are put up to that I think are a shame.
Well, if bioregionalism really does take off and economies become more regional and local, and we're all supposed to get a lot of our sustenance from very close to home, maybe that'll change. Because
well, certainly, people are doing that themselves if they're hunters. That's big, and a lot of people are getting into hunting because of that very reason. But there's a lot of people that are never going to hunt, but might buy some venison if it was available, and that would have the extra motivation to hunt more deer.
Well, if we can, let's move to something near and dear to my heart: tracking and all your work in tracking. I'm on your tracking page. Everybody can check it out at rolandkays.com under tracking. I have a million questions, but I'm going to start with the big headline that you tracked seeds being moved around by rodents. I mean, that's hardcore tracking, man.
Yeah, that was great. That was super fun. That was a totally one of those projects where you go in there trying to test one question and you come out having answered a totally different question that you didn't even know about.
I imagine. I mean, that's got to be, it's really getting down to a level. We used to do service projects in the Sky Island region, and to pay people back for their volunteer work, we would teach them, as I mentioned to you earlier, with people like Sue Morris would come in and help teach them tracking and just teach them how to look at the land in a different way than just being peak baggers, which a lot of our people typically were. They were just like mountain climbers, and they would just blow past all this stuff, where in this scenario, we would take 3 or 4 hours or more just to go a mile. And Sue would be pulling us off trail like crazy, showing us little bear hairs on the bark and everything else. So there's that kind of tracking that I think most people are, if they know anything about it, that's the kind of stuff they're familiar with. But this high tech stuff that you're doing, talk a little bit about that. Like, you're doing some different things than what I think people think of when they think of tracking the traditional way.
Yeah, well, sure. So, tracking, the sort of footprint tracking is useful, and it's one of my favorite things to do. Jump on animals' footprints in the snow and see what they're doing. You can learn so much about them, but you don't always have snow, and sometimes you need a little technology to help see where an animal's going. And so that's something we've been doing a lot of work with over the years, using different kinds of electronic tracking tags. These days they're mostly GPS, but sometimes they're also what I call the old school pinger tags, the VHF tags, where there's this radio ping that's going out, and you wave your antenna around, and you can find where the radio transmitter is by pointing your antenna in that direction. And so those tags are still used for a lot of projects, like the seed tracking we did. The seeds were so small, we had to have a really small tag, and the GPS was too small for that. It was too big for that, so we used radios for that. But the GPS tags have really revolutionized how we follow animals, how we understand where animals go, how they spend their time, where they migrate to, and especially these days, a lot of these questions are how are they dealing with humans on the landscapes. And so the tags now are, they're getting small, they're lightweight, so they don't have much of an impact on the animals. They can record these GPS fixes sometimes every few minutes or even every few seconds, and then send the data back to you so you can follow these animal movements all over the place and really see exactly what they're doing. This increased temporal resolution. So let's say we used to get a fix maybe a couple times a day or maybe a couple times a week, and you would kind of try to guess where the animal was in between those points. Now you get a point every few minutes. You can see exactly where they're going. And we had one project where we were working on urban fishers, and we could tell exactly where they crossed the road because it was such good resolution. We went there and found out, oh, they're using these little drainage culverts to get under the road. These are actually really, really important for these animals to be able to move from one forest fragment to another forest fragment without getting hit by the cars. And we would have never known that if we had a lower resolution type of data.
When you were talking in your video about the foxes, which I highly recommend everybody check out, super, super interesting. The big burrow with all the different holes, all the different things around that tree. You mentioned that you had gotten a ping like a few minutes after you left your camera trap. We used to have camera traps that were really, really remedial and extraordinarily expensive for the time back in the 90s. And you would have to come in and just pick them up and then go develop the film. And then you would find out what was there. So like a lot of time had passed. You got to let time pass to let the trap fill up with pictures. Tell me what that technology is like today, because I think you guys are really spoiled now.
Well, yeah. So certainly we're all using digital cameras now. And so that's a huge difference. That's the biggest difference. We're not reliant on 36 exposures on a roll of film. We can leave the cameras out longer. We can get more pictures. We can get video.
Color.
And so that's really great. The live data is possible. It's expensive. And for the science that I do, it's not usually that important. So I have a couple live cameras I use sort of for these sort of educational outreach types of projects, or I'll use them to sort of monitor a trap or something where I really need the live data. But basically each one of those is a cell phone texting plan. So, we have a project, we just picked up 50 cameras at a site that we set out a month before. I can't afford to pay 50 cell phone bills just to get the live data when it's not that hard to just go pick them up and get the memory card off, out of the camera. So most of the work we do now with cameras is they just save it to the memory card. We put the camera out, we come back a month later, check on it, and get the data back. And that's fine for the types of projects that we're doing. The people who are really pushing on the live cameras are usually around security. So where they're looking for poachers and they need to know, the rangers need to know right now that there's a poacher out in this particular quadrant. And so that's where they really need the live data. The running around the woods part is the most important part.
Right.
So I like to have that as still part of the job, that I got to go put the cameras out or go pick them up. And, I find a lot of times just having that firsthand experience on the landscape really helps me make sense of the data when it comes back later. When I've been to a site, I have a better feel for what's there, for what might be impacting, what the landscape's like, what the surrounding area is like. A lot of our work now with cameras has been as a citizen science project, where we have volunteers that help us run the cameras, which is great because now we can run cameras in thousands of places without traveling there myself. And it's great because it engages the public in the research. They get to see the animals. They actually become advocates for the local wildlife, which is really super. But then I end up with this giant data set of places that I've never been, so I don't have quite the same insight. I have to use remote sensing or some other data to try to ask the research questions with it.
But what's that feel like though, to see something light up like a Christmas tree? I mean, there are some things, great big data set, but there's got to be times in the past where you were like, I wish I had that big data set. I wish we had a citizen project that, would really light this thing up. Was that emotional for you? Was that a really big deal? Like, look at this, look how we can see. Are you seeing other things that you weren't able to see in finer detail? I would imagine you were.
Well, yeah. I mean, we're able to see it across the state. So we have a project now funded by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. It's called Candid Critters, and we have volunteers all across the state. We've had cameras run now in all 100 counties of the state, and so we're able to get this statewide sort of very detailed look at what's going on with the wildlife populations, where the animals live, what their sort of relative abundances are, And now we're starting to, analyze the data and ask some questions about, well, what are the factors that are impacting the populations? How important is development for certain species? All sorts of different things. So it's definitely a gold mine, but it's also sort of, these big data projects have these trade-offs where it lets you see things in much, much better resolution, but at the same time, then you've got to, be ready to handle massive data sets and have this sort of analytical pipeline set up to make the discoveries using the long series of zeros and ones. And
what's an example of the results of something like that?
so we had one actually that was interesting, where we worked with volunteers to survey 32 parks across 6 states. So these were state parks, they were game lands, they were nature preserves, all sorts of different places. And we set up the project. We wanted to evaluate what's the impact of hunting and hiking on wildlife populations. There had been some studies that had showed that hiking was really negative for wildlife populations. And from one study out in California, and that really surprised me and didn't kind of jive with what I've seen out here in the East. And so we set up this project where we had 2 parks that were near each other. So they were the same sort of elevation, same forest type, one that was hunted, one that was not hunted. And then at each of those, we had volunteers set cameras on the trail, near the trail, and far from the trail. We got all the data back. The volunteers looked at all the pictures. They uploaded the pictures. They identified the pictures. We went back and verified all the picture IDs. We got all the data into one big data set, and then ran a bunch of statistical models to evaluate, all right, what's the impact of habitat type versus hunting versus hiking on all these different species. We had 12 different species. And we found overall habitat was much more important than hunting or hiking on wildlife populations. Hiking generally had relatively minor effects. Some species it didn't matter at all. Some species it had a little bit of a negative effect. I think red foxes were actually attracted to the highly hiked trails for some reason. And then hunting, it did have somewhat of an impact on the most hunted species like deer, squirrels, and raccoons, which you would hope you would see some of that, because that's, they're removing the animals from the population. So indeed, we did see a decline in those numbers. And interesting, coming back to our coyote discussion, we actually found more coyote activity in the areas that were hunted than the areas that were not hunted, which we don't know for sure why, but I think it's what I was talking about earlier about how when you remove one coyote, 5 come in to try to take its place. And so I think that was just kind of this, it was creating this magnet for all the young dispersing coyotes to come in, and you ended up with actually more coyotes in the areas that were getting hunted.
That's crazy. Man, I bet you have a lot of stories. You're fun to sit around a campfire with it, I bet.
Well, thanks. I like sitting around campfires, so I like hearing other people's stories too. In fact, I'd like to put in a plug for my podcast, which is kind of like
please
stories
do.
around the campfires. I have a new podcast coming out. I think it's gonna the first episode is gonna come out on June 11th. It's called Wild Animals, and it's stories. It's crazy stories about animals told by the people who study them. So I interview different biologists who have done a specific project where they've tracked an animal, and we talk about a specific animal, like Pluie the wolf. And the biologist, in this case, Mark Hebblewhite, tells the story of Pluie, how he first met him and what the tracking data showed, and then talk about the rest of the research and, some of the other animals too, but kind of use the arc of the story of the animal. So we've got mountain lions in Hollywood, and pythons in the Everglades, and elephants in Africa, all kinds of interesting stories coming up for that. And so that's, also part of what I like to do is try to use, not only the data that we get to help inform conservation, but also some of the stories that come out of running around the woods and following animals, and try to use that to help get people, excited and passionate about the animals as well.
Absolutely crucial. In my opinion, you're doing an incredible service there, because we don't have enough stories. We have a lot of headlines. There's just a really big hole. And I will absolutely be your first subscriber. And go to rolandkays.com, KAYS.com. And I'm sure that you have some way for people to follow you all over the place. I know you have a Twitter account where we can see, you mentioned something about foxes. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I've got Roland Kays on Twitter, and then we also the fox video you mentioned a few years ago. We stumbled onto this fox den and followed it with a camera trap, and we followed it every year, and we've actually upgraded the camera trap so we get really nice video now. And every year the red foxes have come back. And so you get to see the parents sort of hanging around, and then you get to see for the first time, the fox puppies come up and sort of explore their world. And they're just these cute little fuzzballs. It's incredible. And you get to see the fox parents bringing in, rabbits and squirrels and duck. Someone brought in a goose head the other day. So you can see all the different food they're bringing in. And then there's also been, pretty much every year, a coyote lurking around and trying to get into the den. He's too big, or she's too big to get into the den. But she did steal some food from the foxes this year earlier. So we update it pretty regularly. So right now there's 3 puppies playing around. They're getting pretty feisty. I haven't seen the coyote in a little while, so maybe the coyotes moved on. But we're waiting to watch the puppies grow up, and eventually they'll leave. All of a sudden one day they'll stop coming by. But until then, or you can go back and look at the old pictures. It's that Twitter account's called Camtrap Live.
I see one here. I've just been looking at this fox trying to figure out what's going on. That is awesome. Camtrap Live and also Roland Kays. Those are both Twitter accounts you guys need to follow. Yep. I love live camera stuff. I love seeing this. We'll talk really quickly about the care and the precaution that you guys take to make sure that people don't know locations of these things.
So for sure, the fox den. I don't give away the exact location of the fox den. I mean, it's in Raleigh, North Carolina, but whatever. But actually, we do give away a lot of our camera trap data. We make it publicly available because we want to encourage other scientists to use it and to answer their own questions, or even school kids. We actually have projects where school kids help us run cameras, and so we like to make the data available to them. Endangered species are protected. So if we have some cameras running in India right now, for example, and if we get a tiger picture in India, we don't share that location of that exactly where that tiger was. But for other species, I mean, if you want to hunt a deer, you don't need my data from 2 years ago to tell you where a deer was.
Right.
They're all over the place. So we actually are really pro open data and really sort of data sharing, and want to encourage that to be able to do better research and make better conservation decisions.
So allay everyone's fears, because it seems like it's not a big deal to you, and you would know because you have the data, what goes on out there. Is that just much ado about nothing, or have there been instances where ne'er-do-wells have used any data that's out there to track down animals in order to try to grab them?
Yeah, interesting. So there's kind of 2 sides. There's the camera side, and there's the animal tracking side. From the camera side, I really don't think I've never heard of it actually happening. I think, the data tends to be available months or years later. And so by then, the animals are moving on, and, people on the ground who are looking to hunt something are going to be looking for footprints, or, something a lot more immediate, or running their own cameras and getting information immediately. So I really don't think it's ever happened, and don't think it's a big risk. There is, the tracking data is more live. And so that's where it could potentially, if someone wanted to hunt poach a rhino and there was a tracking tag on it, they could potentially use that to find them directly. Biologists know that, and so they're generally pretty smart about doing that. They have to be careful. I know the folks out in Yellowstone had to people were trying to use the radio frequencies to find the wolves to take pictures of them, and they just didn't really want people harassing the wolves that much, and so they were trying to find ways to sort of scramble the code so they wouldn't be able to do that. And so we're sensitive about the live data. We give some live data away, so we have an app called Animal Tracker where you can follow animals in real time. So there's a bald eagle that we've been following now for 4 years that migrates all over the place. It's sitting right now on the coast of Lake Erie, and it moves between South Carolina and Montreal, and it's super fun to follow that animal every day and see where it is. I don't really have much of a concern that someone's going to go shoot that bald eagle, right?
Yeah.
But if it was something that was huntable, then I would be more reluctant about making those data public. So we think a lot about it. We try to be careful about it.
What's fascinating to me here is it feels like in talking to you, you're plugged into, you keep mentioning these trackers and these data feeds and these things that you follow, and when an eagle that you're tracking on this app has landed in some weird place that nobody expected or whatever. Can you give us a little instruction on how, we can start following the Camtrap Live stuff, but what other ways could we get integrated with the kind of work that you do and just feel like we know more about what's going on the ground in our favorite places?
Well, if you're in North Carolina, you can run a camera trap with us as part of the Candid Critters project. We loan them out through local library systems. And so you can, once you take our online training, you qualify to check out a camera trap and you can run it, and then you get to see the animals and then send us all the pictures and we get to use the data. And then the sort of engagement side on the, mentioned the podcast, the camera trap feed, and then the animal tracker app is the other kind of main engagement piece where we have different animals around the world. I mean, and this isn't, most of these data are not mine. There are other biologists doing studies on different animals that have made the data available through this animal tracker app.
It's sort of like getting a first person or VIP backstage pass feel, because I think a lot of people like me all too frequently get our stuff from those months or even year-old reports that somebody does an article on, and it's neat to read about and everything. But I think there's people like me out there who would really love to be keyed in on this stuff a little bit more, like a little closer to when it's happening and feel more on the ground. So those are really cool tools, and thank you for sharing them.
Once you kind of get invested in one of these animals, you really want to see, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? And, oh my God, what's he doing way up in Montreal?
If you can have a net like you're describing where you can put together data, put together stories from different sources, it feels a little bit more organic that way. So it's very
well, that's what we're doing. We're trying to find ways to tell the stories of these animals, because there's so many interesting things happening. So much drama in the lives of these animals, and we're able to get at it like never before, is to get those stories out there. So it's not just us geeky data nerds who get to see it, but share it with the broader world as well.
Well, you guys can get keyed in here at rolandkays.com. That's a good starting point. And I think everything else we talked about kind of branches off of your site. Roland, thank you so much. This has been really, really fun. I kind of tend to geek out on all of this stuff, but so do our listeners, because there's more and more of them and they seem to like what we're doing here. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to chat. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Be sure to visit rewilding.org to subscribe so you don't miss past and future episodes. And while you're there, please consider supporting Rewilding by making a donation or subscribing to the Rewilding Earth newsletter.